If you like our short stories, please like, comment, and subscribe to Lore Spark. The Price of the Patch. The pumpkin patch lay at the edge of the village, forgotten by most, feared by all. Surrounded by a thicket of old trees, gnarled and twisted like the fingers of a witch, the field had a reputation that was passed down through generations. The villagers knew to avoid it after dark. There were whispers, of course, stories of strange happenings in the night, voices that seemed to come from the pumpkins themselves, offering dark promises to those foolish enough to listen. But most of those stories were half-forgotten memories, the kind of tales that keep children awake at night and fade in the light of day. Except for Jonas. Jonas had lived in the village his entire life, and until recently, he had been like the others, dismissing the pumpkin patch as nothing more than an old wives' tale. He never believed in ghosts, spirits, or curses. He believed in what he could see and touch, and he had seen enough tragedy in his life to know that some losses could never be undone. His daughter, Emma, had been his entire world. From the moment she was born, her bright eyes and infectious laughter had filled the house with light. His wife, Sarah, had once been the center of his universe, but as the years passed, their marriage had grown distant, each of them preoccupied with their own private griefs and regrets. But Emma had been the one thing that kept him going, the one pure thing left in his life, and then she was gone. It had been an accident, or so they said. One moment, she had been playing in the garden, chasing after butterflies, her laughter echoing in the warm summer air. The next, she had run into the street, too quick for anyone to stop her. Jonas remembered the sound of screeching tires, the sickening thud, the way his legs gave out beneath him when he saw her small, broken body lying on the asphalt. They had buried her on a warm June afternoon, the sky clear and bright, mocking him with its indifference. People came to the funeral, offering condolences and meaningless platitudes. She's in a better place now. Time will heal the pain. Everything happens for a reason. Jonas wanted to scream at them, to tell them that there was no reason, no justice in the world that would take away a child like Emma. But he stayed silent, staring at the small coffin as it was lowered into the ground, feeling the cold emptiness that would never leave him. Sarah left him a month later. She didn't say much, just packed a suitcase and walked out the door one morning while Jonas sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where Emma used to sit, imagining her smiling face. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't have the energy to care. He spent the next few months in a daze, going through the motions of living, but feeling nothing. His home was a mausoleum now, filled with memories that only deepened the ache in his chest. The silence was suffocating. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All he could think about was Emma, her laughter, her voice, the way she used to curl up in his lap and ask him to tell her stories before bed. The thought of never hearing her voice again was unbearable. It was on one of those sleepless nights, sitting alone in his living room with an empty bottle of whiskey at his side, that he remembered the story of the pumpkin patch. The legend said that on the night of the harvest moon, the pumpkins would whisper to those who dared to enter the field. They would offer anything you desired, no matter how impossible. But there was always a price that only the desperate would be willing to pay. Jonas had dismissed the story as foolishness, a tale to scare children into staying home at night. But now, as he sat alone in the darkness, the idea began to gnaw at the edges of his mind. What if it were true? What if there was a way to bring Emma back? He tried to push the thought away, telling himself that it was madness, that no amount of desperation could make him believe in fairy tales. But the more he thought about it, the more the idea burrowed into his mind, taking root in the empty space where hope had once lived. By the time the harvest moon rose, Jonas had made his decision. He left his house just after sunset, the air cool and crisp as autumn settled over the village. The streets were empty, the windows dark, as if the village itself was holding its breath. He walked with purpose, his heart hammering in his chest as he approached the edge of the woods where the pumpkin patch lay. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. He could hear the rustle of leaves beneath his feet, the distant call of an owl. But other than that, there was silence. As he stepped into the field, a chill ran down his spine. The pumpkins lay scattered across the ground, their orange skins glowing faintly in the moonlight, casting long shadows that seemed to move and shift as he walked among them. He could feel his pulse quicken, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, some grand sign, some ghostly figure to appear and make the offer. But there was nothing, just the pumpkins and the quiet. And then he heard it. At first, it was barely a whisper, a faint rustling like the wind moving through the trees. He stopped, listening intently, his heart pounding in his ears. The sound grew louder, more distinct, like voices murmuring just beyond the edge of hearing. He turned in a slow circle, searching for the source, but there was no one there. "Jonas!" The voice was soft, almost soothing, as if carried on the breeze. "Jonas, we know what you seek." His breath caught in his throat. The voice was familiar, achingly familiar. "Emma?" He took a step forward, his hands trembling. "Emma, is that you? Come closer, Jonas." The voice was clearer now, and it was unmistakably Emma's. "I can help you. I can come back. Don't you want to see me again?" He stumbled forward, his heart racing with a mixture of hope and terror. He had to be dreaming. This couldn't be real. But the voice, it was so real, so vivid. It was Emma's voice. He would know it anywhere. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Just a small price, Jonas. Something you won't miss. A piece of you for a piece of me." He hesitated, the words hanging in the air like a weight pressing down on him. But the thought of seeing Emma again, of hearing her laugh, was too much to resist. "What do you want?" he whispered. "A finger, perhaps, just the tip, something small." His stomach twisted at the request, but he was already pulling a knife from his pocket. His hands shook as he placed the blade against the tip of his pinky finger. With one swift motion, he sliced it off. Pain exploded through his hand, but he barely registered it. He watched, detached, as the blood dripped onto the ground, soaking into the dirt beneath the pumpkins. The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, from the darkness, he heard a soft giggle. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. And there she was, Emma. She stood at the edge of the field, bathed in the pale light of the moon, her face exactly as he remembered it. Her wide, innocent eyes stared up at him, her lips curving into a smile. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and sweet. Jonas fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "Emma, oh God, Emma!" He reached for her and she ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck. He held her tightly, his heart bursting with joy. She was warm, solid, real. His little girl was back. For the next few days, it was as if nothing had ever happened. Emma was there, alive and vibrant, laughing and playing as if the accident had never taken place. She didn't remember it. She didn't remember anything about that day. And Jonas didn't care. He had his daughter back, and that was all that mattered. But then things started to change. At first it was subtle. Emma didn't seem to need sleep anymore. She would lie in bed at night, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. When Jonas asked if she was tired, she would shake her head and smile, telling him she wasn't sleepy. And then there was the cold. Her skin was always cold to the touch, no matter how many blankets he wrapped her in. He told himself it was nothing, that it didn't matter. She was back, and that was enough. But the changes grew worse. She stopped eating, saying she wasn't hungry, and then she began asking him strange questions. Questions that made his skin crawl. "Daddy, what happens when people die?" He tried to brush it off, telling her that it was something she didn't need to worry about. But the questions kept coming, more and more disturbing. "Daddy, do people hurt when they die? Do they feel scared?" Emma asked one night, her voice soft yet unsettling. She sat at the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on him, wide and unblinking. Jonas felt a chill run down his spine. He forced a smile, trying to hide the growing unease that gnawed at him. "No, sweetie, they don't feel anything." "Why are you asking such things?" Emma tilted her head, her lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I just want to know, so I can understand." "Understand what?" Jonas asked, his voice shaky. His daughter's questions, once innocent, now sounded like the musings of something far older, something dark and twisted. Her smile widened. "So I can understand what I'll feel when it's my turn again." That night, Jonas didn't sleep. He sat in the living room, staring at the closed door to Emma's room, the house unnervingly silent. His mind raced with doubts, with fears. This wasn't his daughter. Not really. She looked like Emma, sounded like her, but something was horribly wrong. The warmth, the liveliness that once radiated from her. It was gone. The more time passed, the more distant she seemed, like a pale imitation of the girl he had lost. The whispers came back to him, haunting his thoughts. The voice had promised her return, but had never said at what cost. And Jonas had been too blinded by grief to question it. Now the price was becoming clearer with each passing day. This wasn't Emma. This was something else. Something that wanted more than just to be in his life. Something that wanted everything. The next day, Jonas returned to the pumpkin patch. The sky was overcast, a thick blanket of clouds smothering the light of the sun. He marched through the twisting trees, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. The patch was as he had left it. Silent, the pumpkins scattered across the field, their orange skins glowing faintly in the dim light. But there was an air of menace now, something dark lurking just beneath the surface. "Why are you here, Jonas?" The voice greeted him before he even stepped into the field, a low whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have what you wanted, don't you?" Jonas swallowed hard, his throat dry. "That thing in my house, it's not Emma." The voice chuckled, soft and mocking. "Oh, but it is, Jonas. You wanted her back and I gave her to you, just as she was. But you knew there was a price. There is always a price. Take her back," Jonas demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Take her back and leave us alone." The laughter grew louder, more sinister. "You don't understand, do you, Jonas? She can't go back. She's here now with you. And she will stay until the balance is paid." Jonas felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. "What do you want? What more could you possibly take from me? More? Oh, Jonas, I don't just want more. I want all of you. Your pain, your joy, your memories, your soul. She will stay, Jonas, until there is nothing left of you but a hollow shell. Only then will she go." Panic surged through him. He had to stop this, had to find a way to undo the bargain. He couldn't let this thing take everything from him. He couldn't let it have Emma. He turned and fled the patch, the voices' laughter echoing behind him, following him through the trees, taunting him. That night he sat in the living room, staring at the door to Emma's room, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to do something, but what? He couldn't fight this thing. It was beyond him, beyond anything he understood. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let it take him, and he couldn't let it keep Emma. The next morning, Jonas went to the village priest. Father Collins had been around long enough to know all the old stories, all the superstitions that the village had tried to forget. Jonas explained everything, about the pumpkin patch, the whispers, the deal he had made. Father Collins listened, his face growing paler with every word. "The pumpkin patch," Father Collins muttered when Jonas finished, his voice trembling. "It's cursed. No one has entered it in years. It's said that a spirit, a dark entity, lives there. It feeds on despair, on loss. It promises what the living want most, but the price is always too high." "How do I stop it?" Jonas asked, his voice frantic. "How do I get Emma back?" Father Collins shook his head slowly. "I don't know if you can. The dead, they're not meant to come back. You've opened a door that was never meant to be opened." Jonas's hands clenched into fists. "There must be something, some way to end this." The priest hesitated, then finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "There is one way. You must go back to the patch. You must return what you took. The spirit will take it back, but you will have to give up everything. Your memories of her, your love for her, everything that ties her to this world. Jonas's heart sank. To let Emma go again, it was unthinkable. But as he looked into Father Collins's eyes, he knew there was no other choice. He had to do it, or the thing in his home would consume him, would take everything, and still leave him with nothing. That night, as the full moon hung high in the sky, Jonas made his way back to the pumpkin patch. His heart was heavy, his steps slow. The field stretched out before him, dark and silent, the pumpkins glowing faintly in the moonlight. He stepped into the patch, feeling the air grow thick around him, the whispers beginning once more. "Jonas," the voice crooned, "you've come to make another deal?" He shook his head, tears blurring his vision. "No more deals. I'm here to end it." The ground beneath his feet trembled, the pumpkins seeming to pulse with a dark, malevolent energy. "You can't end it, Jonas. You belong to me now. She belongs to me." "No!" Jonas stepped forward, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. "I'm taking her back." The voice laughed, a deep guttural sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. "You can't take her back. She's already mine." Jonas reached into his pocket, pulling out the small knife he had carried with him. He knew what he had to do. The final sacrifice. The one thing that would break the bond between the spirit and his daughter. He pressed the blade against his chest, his hands shaking. "For Emma," he whispered, and plunged the knife into his heart. The world seemed to explode around him, the ground heaving and splitting open, the pumpkins rotting and collapsing into themselves. The voice screamed, a high-pitched wail of fury and pain. And then, silence. When the villagers found Jonas the next morning, he was lying in the pumpkin patch, his face peaceful, a smile on his lips. Emma was gone, her memory fading from the minds of those who had known her, like a dream slipping away in the light of dawn. And the pumpkin patch? It lay empty, quiet. The whispers gone, the pumpkins dead and withered. But the villagers knew better than to enter it. Some things were better left forgotten.
If you like our short stories, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. The Bone Garden Hartsville was known for its gardens. People came from all over to see them. The lush roses, sunflowers that stood taller than most men, peonies and tulips that seemed to bloom brighter and more vibrant than anywhere else in the world. The flowers were the pride of the town, tended with care and devotion by everyone who lived there. Every home had a garden, every street lined with blossoms in full bloom, their perfume thick in the air, almost suffocating at times. Some said you could smell the flowers long before you entered Hartsville, as if the town was trying to pull you in. But Hartsville had another tradition, one that wasn't advertised on postcards or shared with outsiders, a ritual that ensured the gardens never stopped growing. Sophie had grown up in Hartsville, but she had never fully understood the town's darker secret. The lottery was a tradition held every year on October 1st, just as the leaves began to fall and the air cooled for autumn. The smell of decaying leaves mixed with the overpowering fragrance of flowers always made Sophie feel queasy. No one talked about what happened after the lottery, not to the children at least. To Sophie, it was a game, like the raffle drawings at school fairs. You hoped your family wouldn't be chosen, but if they were, well, that was just the way it went. Life carried on, at least that's what she thought. She remembered when her friend Melanie's family had been chosen 2 years ago. The atmosphere around town had shifted when the lottery results were announced. Sophie noticed Melanie's parents started to act strange, more distant, quieter, but everyone else had carried on like normal. Melanie stopped coming to school a few days before Halloween, and her family's house, once filled with laughter, became silent. The garden there grew wild and unruly, the flowers almost too large, too vibrant, as if they were feeding on something more than soil. Her parents explained it away as the family moving for a job in another town. Sophie hadn't believed it, but she didn't push. After all, no one really questioned what happened to the chosen families. It was just one of those things adults knew but didn't talk about, at least not to the younger generation. But that year, things changed for Sophie. When her father pulled the slip of paper from the black velvet bag on October 1st and turned it over to reveal the number 17, Sophie's world began to unravel. She watched his face turn pale, saw her mother's hand tremble as she squeezed his arm. The crowd in the town square murmured quietly, but no one seemed surprised. Sophie could feel the air shift, thick with unease, the way it had when Melanie's family had been chosen. The flowers around the square seemed to lean toward them, as if they were waiting. Only this time it was her family. The mayor gave his usual speech, the same one Sophie had heard every year since she was a child. Your family will honor Hartsville by making the ultimate sacrifice at the Great Bloom Festival. Thanks to your gift, our gardens will continue to flourish, and Hartsville will remain a place of beauty and prosperity. The words sent a chill down her spine. As the speech went on, Sophie couldn't help but glance at the flowers surrounding them, the roses blooming unnaturally fast, petals fluttering to the ground like drops of blood. That night, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, her hands gripping the edge of her chair, while her parents whispered in the living room. They thought she couldn't hear them, but she caught snippets of the conversation. Words like ritual, necessary, and for the good of the town. But beneath the rehearsed phrases, Sophie could hear the fear in their voices, feel the tremor in their words. But Sophie had questions no one had ever answered. Why did chosen families leave without a word? What really happened at the Great Bloom Festival on Halloween night? Why did people treat it like some grand honor but act like it was a death sentence? She was done being in the dark. The next morning, after her parents had left for work, Sophie decided to find the answers herself. She started in the town library, combing through old town records, but found nothing. The festival was mentioned, the lottery, the gardens, but no mention of what the sacrifice truly was. It was as if the town had scrubbed its history clean. Even the oldest records were carefully worded, leaving out crucial details. Sophie's frustration mounted as she left the library empty-handed. There had to be someone in this town who knew the truth, someone who would tell her. As she walked the quiet streets, an idea sparked in her mind. Hilda. Hilda was the town's oldest resident, a woman who lived in a dilapidated house on the outskirts of Hartsville, hidden behind walls of ivy and tangled vines. No one talked about her much. Some said she was crazy, that she'd lost her mind after her own family had been chosen in the lottery decades ago. But Hilda wasn't like everyone else in town. She was a relic of a time when people questioned things. Sophie hesitated outside Hilda's gate, unsure of what she might find. The gate was overgrown with wildflowers, their sickly sweet scent suffocating in the autumn air. She could almost feel the flowers watching her, but she was done being afraid. She knocked on the door, her knuckles brushing against the cracked wood. The door creaked open, revealing a thin, frail woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through Sophie. "You're the one they picked this year," Hilda said, her voice low and raspy. Sophie's heart thudded in her chest. "How did you—" "I know because I've seen it happen too many times," Hilda interrupted, stepping aside to let Sophie in. "You're here because you want to know the truth, aren't you?" Sophie nodded, her throat dry. She stepped into the dimly lit house, the smell of old books, dust, and something else, something coppery like blood, filling the air. Hilda gestured for her to sit at a small, cluttered table. "They don't tell the children anymore," Hilda said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "They think it's easier that way. Better not to scare the young ones. But ignorance doesn't protect you from what's coming." "What's coming?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hilda sighed. "The lottery isn't just a game, Sophie, it's a death sentence." Hilda told Sophie everything. The town's leaders had kept the ritual alive for centuries, dating back to a time when Hartsville was barren, when crops wouldn't grow and families starved. The legend was that a druid had come to the town and offered them a way out, a ritual sacrifice of one family every year, their blood feeding the earth, ensuring the gardens would grow and the town would thrive. The people were desperate, so they agreed. And for a while it worked. The crops flourished, the gardens bloomed, and the town grew wealthy. But over time, the town no longer needed to rely on the land. Food could be brought in from other places, and farming wasn't necessary anymore. The gardens, though, those gardens had become the town's treasure. The flowers were unnaturally beautiful, enhanced by the blood of the sacrificed families. Tourists came from all over to see the miraculous blooms, bringing in money that made the town's leaders rich. The townspeople believed they were still making sacrifices to keep the crops growing, but the truth was far worse. The sacrifice was only for appearances, to make sure the flowers stayed perfect, to ensure Hartsville remained a tourist destination. "They kill for flowers," Hilda said, her voice dripping with disgust. "And your family is next." Sophie's mind reeled as she walked back home, the weight of Hilda's words pressing down on her chest. Her family had no idea what was coming. They had spent their entire lives believing in the town's traditions, trusting that the leaders knew what was best. They had no clue they were about to be killed for the sake of the gardens, and no one would stop it unless she did. Halloween night came, and with it the Great Bloom Festival. The town square was transformed into a spectacle of lights, flowers, and eerie decorations. Pumpkins lined the streets, their carved faces grinning ominously in the flickering candlelight. The overwhelming scent of flowers was thick in the air, mixing with the smoky bonfires, turning the night into a haze of color and scent. Sophie stood among the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent the last few days gathering evidence, documents proving that the food had been outsourced for decades, records showing how the town's leaders had profited from the ritual while keeping everyone else in the dark. She could barely think over the stench of the flowers, their perfume clawing at her lungs. She saw her parents standing near the bonfire, laughing with friends, completely unaware of what was about to happen. The crowd cheered as the mayor took the stage, his voice booming over the festivities. "Tonight, we celebrate the beauty and prosperity of our town. Thanks to the sacrifice made by our chosen family, Hartsville will continue to flourish. Our gardens will continue to bloom, and we will remain a beacon of beauty and prosperity." Sophie's stomach churned. She had to stop it. She had to make them see the truth. "Wait!" she shouted, pushing her way through the crowd. All eyes turned toward her as she climbed onto the stage, her hands shaking as she held up the documents. "The sacrifices aren't about keeping the land fertile," she said, her voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. "The crops don't matter. The flowers don't need blood to grow. This is all about money." The crowd murmured, confused. The mayor's smile faltered, but he quickly recovered, waving her off. "Sophie, this isn't the time. It's the only time," Sophie interrupted, her voice rising. "You've been lying to everyone. The sacrifices aren't for the land, they're for you. The leaders get rich from the tourists who come to see the gardens, and they use our families as pawns to keep it going." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sophie held up the documents, reading from the proof she had gathered. The outsourcing of food, the profits from the gardens, the manipulation of the town's history. It all spilled out, and the crowd grew angrier with every word. "You've been killing people for nothing," someone shouted. The mayor's face drained of color. "That's enough." "No," Sophie said, stepping forward, her voice steady now. "It's not enough. You've lied to all of us, and it ends tonight." The townspeople, dressed in their Halloween costumes, began to close in, their faces dark with realization. The air crackled with tension as the truth finally broke through the surface. The mayor, seeing the growing fury in the crowd, began to back away, his smile gone. "This is for the good of the town," he said, his voice wavering. "It's necessary." "No, it's not," Sophie said, her voice ringing through the square. The crowd surged forward. Sophie's heart pounded as chaos erupted around her. The townspeople turned on the leaders, dragging them down from the stage, shouting accusations and demanding answers. The bonfires roared higher, the flames licking the night sky, casting an eerie glow over the scene. For the first time, Hartsville was tearing itself apart. Finally, the truth had been unearthed, and it was more terrible than anyone could have imagined. The next morning, the sun rose over Hartsville, and the gardens were as beautiful as ever. The sacrifice hadn't happened, and yet the flowers still bloomed. The town had been freed from its dark tradition, and the people had taken control of their future. Sophie stood at the edge of the town square, watching the petals sway gently in the breeze. For the first time in generations, the town was free from the lies that had held it captive. But not everything was settled. She knew that some in town would resist change, that some still clung to the old ways, believing the ritual had saved them. There would be battles ahead, but the truth was out now, and the town would never be the same. As her family prepared to leave Hartsville behind, Sophie glanced back one last time. The gardens still glowed in the morning light, no longer fed by blood, but still somehow beautiful. The flowers hadn't died. The town hadn't withered. The only thing that had withered was the fear that had held them all in chains for so long.
If you like our short stories, please like, comment, and subscribe for more. The Forgotten Return. The day Lucas Connolly was found was an accident. A chilling, earth-shattering accident. It had been 20 long years since Lucas had disappeared, his memory lingering in brimstone like a half-forgotten nightmare. He had been 16, a typical teenager with a mischievous grin and a future full of promise, until he vanished while walking home from school. No signs of foul play, no leads, no closure, just gone, as if he'd been erased from existence. The town searched for months. His parents plastered flyers everywhere, their faces growing hollow with grief as the years passed with no word, no hope. After a while, the name Lucas Connolly became a ghost story, a reminder of what could happen, a tale parents told their children to keep them from wandering off. But then, 2 boys broke into the old McAllister house, an abandoned relic that sat on the edge of town, long forgotten. They weren't supposed to be there, of course. No one had set foot inside the McAllister place in decades. It was the kind of house that loomed at the edge of your peripheral vision, decaying and sagging with the weight of untold stories. But the boys, searching for a place to hide and drink their stolen beers, stumbled across something no one expected to find. Behind a locked door in a back room no one knew existed, they found Lucas. It was the scream that alerted the neighbors, who called the police. When Sheriff McGraw arrived at the scene, it was like stepping into a nightmare. There, huddled in the corner of a dingy, dimly lit room, was Lucas Connolly. His body was thin, his hair long and streaked with gray. He wasn't 16 anymore. He was 36, but he looked far older. His skin clung to his bones like paper, his eyes sunken, dark circles etched beneath them. He didn't react to their presence. He simply stared at the wall, his lips moving silently, as if repeating something only he could hear. They broke down the door and pulled him from the house, but Lucas never resisted. It was like he wasn't there anymore, like whatever Lucas had once been had long since faded. The news spread like wildfire. Lucas Connolly has been found. Bam. His parents rushed to the hospital, tears streaming down their faces as they tried to reconcile the broken man before them with the boy they'd lost. And though the town welcomed him back, murmurs of unease lingered beneath the surface. Something wasn't right. Lucas wasn't just traumatized. He was different. The first disappearance happened a week after Lucas came home. Joey Randall, 32, had just celebrated his birthday. He'd spent the evening with his family, blowing out candles and laughing over beers with friends. By morning, Joey was gone. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence that he had left his home voluntarily. He had simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. It wasn't the first time someone had disappeared in Brimstone. People remembered all too well the string of vanishings that had plagued the town years ago, right around the time Lucas went missing. But this felt different. Joey's disappearance came on the exact day of his birthday, down to the hour. Then it happened again. Karen Mills, 67, went missing after a small family gathering for her birthday. Her son found her bedroom empty the next morning, the window still locked from the inside. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. The pattern began to emerge. Birthdays. Each person who vanished did so within hours of celebrating another year of life. As the number of missing people grew, panic spread through the town like wildfire. And still, Lucas said nothing. He sat quietly in his childhood home, staring out the window, as if waiting for something. Or someone. Sheriff McGraw was no stranger to the bizarre. Brimstone had seen its fair share of unexplained phenomena over the years. But this was something else. He couldn't ignore the timing. Lucas had been found, and now, just like before, people were disappearing. But there was one crucial difference this time. Every single victim vanished on their birthday. The sheriff had known Lucas since he was a kid. He remembered the search, the hopelessness that followed when they couldn't find him. But the man who had returned wasn't the boy he remembered. Lucas barely spoke, and when he did, his words were strange, cryptic, as though he was fighting to keep something buried. It didn't take long for the town to start pointing fingers. Whispers spread, Lucas is behind this. He brought something back with him. His parents, once pillars of the community, were shunned, their house turning into a ghostly island on the outskirts of town. Sheriff McGraw wasn't one for superstition, but something gnawed at him. He had to talk to Lucas. It was late when McGraw knocked on the Connollys' front door. Lucas answered, his movements slow, deliberate. The sheriff hadn't been this close to him since the day they found him. And now, standing face to face with the man, McGraw felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Lucas," McGraw began, stepping inside. "We need to talk." Lucas didn't respond at first. He led the sheriff into the living room and sat down, his eyes drifting toward the window. The silence between them was thick, oppressive, like the room itself was holding its breath. "People are disappearing," McGraw said bluntly, watching for a reaction. "They've gone missing on their birthdays. You have to know something, son. You're the only one who can help." For a long moment, Lucas said nothing. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely reached McGraw's ears, he spoke. "I didn't want to come back." McGraw's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? You were locked away, Lucas. You were taken." "I shouldn't have been found," Lucas continued, his gaze distant. "I wasn't supposed to leave that room. It let me go, but it didn't let me go free." "What let you go?" McGraw's heart pounded in his chest. "Who's behind this?" Lucas turned to face him, his eyes empty, like deep, bottomless wells. "The man who took me wasn't just a man. He was something else. He kept me there in that room for years. I don't know how long. I lost track of time. I don't even know who I am anymore." The sheriff felt a shiver run down his spine. "What did he do to you?" "He told me things," Lucas whispered, his voice trembling. "He got inside my head. He made me forget. But there was always one thing he made sure I remembered. I wasn't taken just to be kept away. I was taken for a purpose." McGraw's stomach twisted. "What purpose?" "To take others." 20 years earlier, Lucas had been held captive by a man, or something that wore the skin of a man. His captor had locked him away in that room, but it wasn't to torture him, at least not in the traditional sense. He never harmed Lucas physically, but he had a darker agenda. The man believed in something ancient, something far older than the town itself. He believed in control over life and death, in the power of souls. He chose Lucas specifically, because on his birthday, Lucas's soul was the perfect sacrifice, the perfect vessel for the ritual the man had been performing for decades. The disappearances had been part of this twisted process, each person vanishing on their birthday because that was when their soul was most tied to the earth. Lucas was brainwashed, slowly and methodically. His sense of self was erased, replaced by the man's teachings, his dark purpose. For years, the man whispered to him, manipulating his mind, bending his will. By the time Lucas was broken enough to obey, the man had what he wanted, control over Lucas's actions, his very thoughts. But before the man could finish what he started, Lucas was found, freed from the room but not from the programming the man had instilled in him. Lucas had become an instrument, a vessel for the same power that had taken him. And now, back in the town, he had no choice but to continue what the man had started, taking people on their birthdays, fulfilling the same ritual that had bound him. "I don't want to do it," Lucas whispered, tears streaming down his face. "But he's still there, in my head. He tells me who to take. He tells me when." The sheriff's blood ran cold. "You've been taking them? You're the reason they're disappearing?" Lucas's sobs grew louder. "I don't remember doing it. I wake up and they're gone. I don't know how to stop it." McGraw stood, pacing the room, trying to make sense of the horror unraveling before him. Lucas wasn't the boy he had once known. He had been transformed into something far darker, something enslaved to a power he didn't understand. And that power was growing stronger with each person who vanished. "Lucas, you're not beyond help," the sheriff said, though his voice wavered. "We can fight this. We can stop him." Lucas shook his head, his hands trembling. "You can't stop it. He's too strong. He'll come for me again. He'll take me back." As the disappearances mounted, the town of Brimstone descended into fear. Birthdays were no longer a cause for celebration. They were a death sentence. People tried to hide, locking themselves away on their birthdays, but it didn't matter. When the clock struck, they were gone, snatched from the world without a sound, without a trace. Lucas grew more and more unstable. He would disappear for hours, returning with no memory of where he had been. Each time someone vanished, Lucas would fall deeper into his despair, his mind fracturing as the captor's voice continued to haunt him. He couldn't escape the man's influence, no matter how far he ran or how hard he fought. The sheriff knew the only way to end this was to confront the source, the man who had taken Lucas, the figure who still controlled him from the shadows. But finding him was a different matter altogether. One night, as the wind howled through the streets and the town huddled in fear, McGraw received a call. Lucas was gone. His parents had found his bed empty, his window open, the air outside cold and biting. But there was something else. A note scrawled in shaky handwriting left on Lucas's pillow. "It's time." And Sheriff McGraw raced to the McAllister house, his gut telling him that Lucas had gone back. The house stood like a specter at the edge of town, its windows dark, its walls sagging with age. He had no backup, no plan, just the desperate hope that he could stop whatever was happening before it claimed Lucas for good. Inside, the air was thick with an unnatural chill. The floor creaked beneath his boots as he made his way through the decaying halls, his flashlight flickering in the oppressive darkness. He called Lucas's name, but the only response was the echo of his own voice. And then he heard it, a faint whisper, coming from the same room where Lucas had been found. McGraw's heart pounded as he approached the door. It was locked, just as it had been before, but this time the sheriff didn't hesitate. He kicked it open, the wood splintering under the force of his boot. Inside, Lucas stood in the center of the room, his back to the door, his body shaking with sobs. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, shifting and twisting as though they were alive. And standing in the corner, barely visible in the dim light, was the man. Tall, skeletal, his face shrouded in darkness. The captor. The entity. McGraw raised his gun, his hands trembling. "Let him go!" The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply raised a long, bony finger and pointed at Lucas. Lucas turned, his face pale and tear-streaked. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I can't fight him." Before the sheriff could react, the shadows surged forward, engulfing Lucas in their cold, suffocating embrace. He was lifted off the ground, his body convulsing as the man's power took hold of him once more. "No!" McGraw shouted, firing his gun, but the bullets passed through the figure as though he were made of smoke. Lucas's eyes met the sheriff's one last time, filled with a haunting resignation. He'll never stop. And then he was gone. By morning, the disappearances had stopped, but Lucas was never seen again. Neither was the man who had taken him. The town of Brimstone was left to wonder if they had been saved, or if the curse had simply claimed its final victim. And though the disappearances ceased, the fear never did, because birthdays still came and went, and the town would always remember the one boy who vanished and then returned, bringing something far darker with him. The end.
If you like our short stories, please like, comment, and subscribe. The weight of the tide, the sea, had always been a part of this town. Its waves carried memories. Sometimes they whispered them. Sometimes they swallowed them whole. For as long as anyone could remember, Halloween was celebrated with large beachside bonfires and eerie legends of the sea. The entire town would gather, laughing, drinking cider, and watching flames consume driftwood as the firelight flickered in sync with the stars above and the dark waves below. It was tradition, something sacred in its simplicity. But this Halloween season felt different. The bonfires still burned, the townspeople still gathered, but something darker had arrived with the tide. A murder had struck the town, then another, and another. The bodies appeared with polished seashells placed in their cold, stiff hands. Each shell, perfectly smooth and foreign to the local waters, bore a number inside it, a cryptic mark that no one could decipher. The killing seemed random. A fisherman, a beloved schoolteacher, a local politician. No pattern, no motive, no connection, except the shells. The morning after the third body was found, Danny stood by the water's edge, the salty air clinging to her skin as she scanned the shoreline. The beach stretched far and wide, empty except for the occasional seagull's cry. It was peaceful, but the peace felt like a facade now. The town was in chaos. Everyone was whispering about the killer, but no one knew what to do. Danny had always felt most comfortable by the sea. As a marine biologist, her work allowed her to retreat into the ocean's mysteries, studying mollusks, tides, and ecosystems. There was something reassuring about the predictability of nature, something solid in its rhythms. But now, standing at the shore, she felt unnerved. The murders had cast a long, cold shadow, a shadow that had just stepped into her life. "Danny?" The voice behind her was soft, tentative. She turned to see Officer Hayes, one of the town's few police officers, standing with a notebook in hand. His face was etched with lines of fatigue, the toll of sleepless nights spent investigating. "Hayes," she greeted, nodding to him. "I figured you'd be here soon." Hayes sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm sorry to ask, but we found another shell. Same as before. We need your help." Her stomach dropped. "Another murder?" He nodded gravely. "Late last night, same pattern." Danny turned back toward the sea, her thoughts racing. She'd been asked to consult on the case when the first shell had been found. After all, if anyone knew mollusks, it was her, but even she hadn't been able to identify the shells. They were from species that didn't live anywhere near these shores. Foreign, untraceable. The town's waters didn't produce them. So how did they end up in the hands of the dead? Danny followed Hayes to the scene. The walk was short, the air brisk and biting. Soon they were standing near a small cabin by the cliffs. A favorite spot for tourists, but today it was marked with police tape. The body had already been removed, but Danny could still feel the heaviness of death lingering in the air. Hayes handed her the shell. Danny held it carefully, her fingers tracing the polished surface. It was beautiful in a strange and unsettling way. Too perfect. She flipped it over, and there it was. The number, etched with precision. 13, she whispered. "What do you think it means?" Hayes asked, watching her closely. "I don't know yet. But these shells, they don't belong here. I've been trying to identify the species, but I can't. They're not local." "Then where are they from?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Danny pocketed the shell, her mind working furiously. "I need more time." Hayes nodded, his face tense. "We're running out of time. The town's already on edge with Halloween so close. If we don't find this killer soon..." He didn't need to finish. They both knew what was at stake. The murders had started just before the Halloween season, and the bonfire was only days away. The entire town would be gathered on the beach. If the killer had plans for that night, Danny shivered, though it wasn't from the cold. "Let me see what I can find out. There has to be a connection we're missing." As Danny left the scene, her mind drifted back to her childhood. Halloween had always been her favorite time of year. Those bonfires on the beach, her family laughing and telling ghost stories as the flames danced against the night sky. But now those memories felt tainted. The fire that once brought warmth now seemed to harbor something darker, something waiting beneath the surface. That night, Danny sat in her small office, the shell lying on the table in front of her. She stared at it, the number 13 glaring back at her, mocking her lack of answers. She had pored over every mollusk encyclopedia she owned, scoured the internet for any species that matched the shell's characteristics. Nothing. Her phone buzzed. A message from Hayes. Another letter was found in the mailbox. "I'll drop it off in the morning." Danny frowned. The letters. Each victim had received an anonymous letter days before their death. Cryptic notes that revealed secrets only the victims knew. The town was small, and secrets rarely stayed buried for long. But these letters were intimate, personal. It was as if someone had been watching these people for years, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She leaned back in her chair, her mind wandering. The shells, the letters, the murders. Then it hit her. The shells weren't just random tokens, they were dates. The numbers inside the shells corresponded to specific days. Days when each victim had visited a particular location around the town. But what connected these places? She grabbed her notebook and started jotting down the coordinates she had mapped from the previous shells. It was a pattern, slowly forming in her mind. All the victims had visited these places, but they weren't just random spots. They were locations from the town's old Halloween celebrations, places tied to the annual bonfire, where generations of families had gathered to mark the holiday. Her heart raced. What if these murders weren't just about the victims? What if they were about the town's traditions, its past? What if the killer was targeting people connected to the bonfire nights? But why? And then, as she stared at the shell in her hand, she realized something even more chilling. The victims weren't random. They were all tied to her family's history, one way or another. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. "You're next. Meet me at the bonfire. Let's finish what we started." Danny's blood ran cold. She had been chasing the killer, but now it was clear. The killer had been leading her all along. Halloween night arrived with a sharp wind blowing off the sea. The town's bonfire roared, flickering wildly in the evening's darkness as the entire town gathered around it, unaware of the horror that had gripped Danny's heart. She stood at the edge of the crowd, scanning the faces around her, searching for the person who had sent the message. The person who knew her darkest secrets. The person who had been orchestrating this game. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the bonfire's glow, a shadow against the flames. It was Lena, her childhood best friend. Lena had left town years ago, disappearing without explanation. Danny's heart pounded in her chest. Why was Lena here? And why now? Lena stepped closer, the flames illuminating her face. There was a coldness in her eyes that Danny had never seen before. Lena, what are you doing here? Danny asked, her voice trembling. You know why I'm here, Lena replied, her tone devoid of warmth. I waited for you, Danny. You never came back. Danny's mind spun. She hadn't seen Lena since that Halloween night when they were teenagers. The night Lena had gone missing after the bonfire. The night that haunted Danny every year. The entire town had searched for Lena for months. Her parents had posted flyers, organized search parties, and gone to the police, but no one ever found her. It was as if Lena had vanished into the night, swallowed by the sea. Danny had never told anyone what really happened that night, not even Lena's parents. Because Danny knew the truth, and she had been too terrified to admit it. I thought you left town. I tried to find you, Danny whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Lena's lips twisted into a bitter smile. I never left, but you, she pointed an accusing finger at Danny. You left me behind. You let them take me. Danny's breath caught in her throat. The memory flashed in her mind, running along the beach with Lena, laughing, until the sound of heavy footsteps, a struggle in the dark, and then nothing. She had run home, thinking Lena had simply gone ahead. But the truth was far darker. I didn't know what to do, Danny began, her voice faltering. I saw them take you, but I was so scared. I thought if I told someone, they'd come for me too. You didn't want to know, Lena spat, her eyes burning with anger. You left me there. You ran, Danny. You abandoned me. And you didn't tell a soul. Danny's legs felt like they were going to buckle beneath her. She had kept that secret for years, burying it deep inside herself, trying to convince herself that she hadn't been at fault. But she had known. She had seen the men drag Lena away that night, but instead of telling anyone, she had hidden the truth out of fear. The kidnappers had threatened her if she spoke, and she had believed them. You didn't care. Lena's voice was sharp and brittle. I was waiting for you to come back, Danny. I thought you would save me, but you never did. Danny's heart pounded in her chest. She shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. I was a kid. I didn't know what to do. And while you were safe in your home, I was trapped. They held me for years, Danny. They tortured me, used me, and when I finally escaped, I vowed I would come back. I swore that I would make everyone pay. Lena took a step closer, her face inches from Danny's. The people I've killed, they were part of it. They knew what happened to me. Some of them even helped cover it up. They helped my kidnappers, Danny. They're not innocent. None of them. Danny stumbled backward, her mind reeling. The killings hadn't been random. Lena had been systematically targeting the people who had been involved in her kidnapping. People who had turned a blind eye. People who had profited from her suffering. And now it was Danny's turn. You think you're a good person, Lena said, stepping closer. But all your choices have been selfish. You abandoned me, and now you're going to pay for it. Lena reached into her coat and pulled out a shell, polished, gleaming in the firelight. You were always meant to be the final piece. Danny stared at the shell, her breath shallow. The shells hadn't been random tokens of the killer's obsession. Lena had chosen them deliberately because she knew the town would ask Danny for help. She had orchestrated the entire thing to lead Danny down this path, to force her to face the truth, to make her feel the guilt she had buried for so long. Each shell had been a breadcrumb, guiding her to this moment, the final piece. Lena! I'm sorry, Danny whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her own guilt. I should have told someone. I should have saved you. Lena's face softened for a moment, but the fury returned quickly. It's too late for that now. You didn't save me then, and you won't save yourself now. The flames from the bonfire roared behind them as Lena took another step closer, Her eyes locked on Danny's. "And now, Danny," Lena said softly, "you're going to burn with the rest of them." The shell slipped from her hand, falling to the sand as the weight of the tide finally crashed over them both.
In the kingdom of ether, mirrors were forbidden. No one questioned it. Everyone accepted it as a commandment passed down through generations. Reflective surfaces were shattered, hidden or covered. The priests said it was the will of the gods, that reflections were dangerous, sinful. They said to see your reflection was to invite the unknown. But for Arik, a kind-hearted young man, these were just tales, and rules were rules, until the night he accidentally saw his own reflection. Arik's life had never been easy. He was different, an outcast. In his village, people mocked him because he could read words backward without difficulty, a trait no one else had. What was a curious gift to him was seen as a curse by others, just one more reason to bully and torment him. He lived a quiet, lonely life, marked by small acts of kindness that went unnoticed in a world that had turned hard and cruel. But everything changed the night he saw his reflection. It was a crisp autumn evening, the air heavy with the smell of burning wood and falling leaves. Arik had gathered with a group of friends, if they could even be called that, around a fire in the village square to listen to old Renard, the storyteller. Renard had lived long enough to know all the old tales, and that night he spoke of the forbidden reflections. "They say the gods forbid mirrors for a reason," Renard began, his voice low and gravelly, the firelight casting shadows across his weathered face. But it wasn't vanity or sin. No, the real reason was far worse. Reflections are doorways. They are the worst parts of us, waiting for a chance to come through. The group fell silent, leaning in to listen. Arik felt a chill run down his spine, though he told himself it was just the cold night air. "They're not just copies of us," Renard continued. "They are shadows, twisted versions, our worst traits given form. If you ever see your reflection, you've already given them what they need. They only need to be seen once. After that, they can follow you. They can take your life." Thomas, the loudest of the group, scoffed. "That's ridiculous! You're saying reflections are monsters? Please, it's just an old man's story." Renard's eyes gleamed with warning. "Mock it if you like, boy, but once they see you, they can find you." Thomas grinned, snatching up a dull, reflective steel plate from a nearby stall. "Let's test this old tale, shall we?" He raised the plate to his face, but before he could look, Arik lunged forward, snatching the plate from his hands. "Thomas, stop! You don't know what you're doing!" Arik warned, but in the chaotic motion the plate spun, catching the firelight. And in that moment, Arik saw his own reflection. It was just for a second, but that was enough. His own eyes stared back at him, but there was something terribly wrong. His reflection didn't blink when he did. Worse, it smiled, a grin that twisted too wide. Arik recoiled, dropping the plate. The metallic clatter echoed through the square, but no one else noticed what had just happened. No one but Arik, who felt his heart pound as the chill of something dark settled inside him. That night, Arik had his first nightmare. He woke up drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. The image of his own grinning face burned into his mind. In the dream, his reflection had been standing at the foot of his bed, watching him, whispering words he couldn't quite understand. Its eyes were black, hollow. Its smile never faltered. It reached for him, cold fingers brushing his skin, and Arik jolted awake. The next night, the dream returned. Only this time, the reflection was closer. It stood over him, leaning down, whispering again, its voice distorted and layered with a sickening, inhuman tone. Arik's days became a waking nightmare as well. Everywhere he went, he saw it, his reflection. In puddles, in windows, in polished metal. It was always there, always grinning, always watching. And it wasn't just a mirror image anymore. It moved when he didn't, smiled when he was terrified. It followed him, stalking him, haunting his dreams every night. No one believed him. The villagers mocked him, called him paranoid. They thought his fears were just more of his strangeness. Even the church dismissed his worries, telling him to pray for guidance. But Arik knew the truth. Something had crossed over, something terrible. His reflection was in his world now. It was a cold, moonlit night when Arik, sleepless and desperate, wandered the village square alone. He had no idea what to do. No one cared. No one believed him. He was losing his grip on reality, the reflection haunting him both in sleep and wakefulness. That's when he met Garen. The older man sat alone on the edge of the square, his eyes shadowed, his face worn with the weight of knowledge. He seemed to be watching Arik closely, as if waiting for him. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Garen said, his voice low and rough. Arik froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Seen what?" "Your reflection," Garen said quietly. "It's in your world now, isn't it?" Arik's blood ran cold. "How do you know that?" Because I've been where you are, Garen said with a heavy sigh. But for me it's too late. I can never go back. What do you mean? Arik asked, sitting down beside him. Garen glanced at him, his eyes filled with understanding. You're not in the real world, Arik. Not anymore. You're in the reflections world. Arik shook his head, confused. What are you talking about? You've been living in a backwards world. That's why everything feels wrong. People here are cruel because they're reflections, twisted versions of the real people who exist in the world you were born in. This is where the worst parts of people stay. Your reflection, the one you saw, was just waiting for the chance to cross over. Arik's mind spun, his pulse racing. But why now? Garen looked away, his expression grim. When you were young, very young, you must have caught a glimpse of yourself. That's all it takes. If a reflection sees you as a child, it takes your place. Your body wasn't strong enough to resist, so it crossed over, and you've been stuck here ever since. You've been living in the reflections world, thinking it was your own. Arik's heart pounded in his chest, and when I saw my reflection in the plate, it got sucked back into its world, Garen explained. That's why it's haunting you now. It's trying to kill you, to take your life for good. If it kills you, it'll take your eyes and return to the real world. My eyes? Yes, Garen said, his voice heavy with regret. Your eyes are the key. They're what the reflection needs to pass back through. If it kills you, it'll take your eyes with it. Once it does, it'll go back to your world and live your life again, and you'll be trapped here forever. Arik swallowed hard. How do I get back? Garen met his gaze, his expression serious. There's only one way. You have to see your reflection again, through the same object. Once more. And then you have to walk through it, into the real world. Arik's head swam with the weight of what Garen was saying. But why can't you go back? Garen's face darkened. My reflection died in the real world. I've been trapped here ever since. With my reflection gone, there's no way for me to ever see myself again. I'll never get out. Arik's chest tightened. You're stuck here? Garen nodded. I heard about you for a long time, but I wasn't sure if you were actually trapped here like me. Then I heard you were being haunted by your reflection in your sleep. That's when I knew. The next night, Arik knew the reflection would come for him again. This time it wouldn't stop until it killed him. He could feel it. He tried to stay awake, but the exhaustion was too much. His eyelids grew heavy, and before long sleep overtook him. And with sleep came the reflection. This time it was right there, standing over him as his body froze. Sleep paralysis gripped him, his heart pounding in terror as the reflection's cold hands wrapped around his throat. I'm almost home, the reflection whispered, its black eyes gleaming with malevolence. Its fingers tightened, and Arik felt his life slipping away. Suddenly, out of the shadows, Garen lunged. With a swift motion, he drove a knife into the reflection's back. The creature shrieked, its body convulsing violently before dissolving into a dark, oily mist. It's dead, Garen said, panting heavily. It can't come back now? Arik sat up, gasping for air. His body trembled with the aftershock of what had just happened, his mind spinning. He had been so close to death, so close to losing everything. He looked at Garen, gratitude and confusion swirling in his chest. But what now? Arik asked, his voice weak. You need to get out of here, Garen said, wiping the black mist from the blade. This world isn't yours. You don't belong here, and you never did. Arik nodded, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had been living in the reflections world all along, a twisted, cruel version of the real world, where everyone around him was a reflection of their worst traits. That's why they were so mean, why his life had felt so miserable. They weren't real. But how do I go back? Arik asked, his voice trembling. You said I have to see my reflection again. But where? Garen pointed to the steel plate that lay on the ground where Arik had first seen his reflection. The surface still faintly gleamed, its dull reflection waiting. There, Garen said. That's where it all started. You need to look at your reflection one last time, and then step through. Arik picked up the plate, staring down at the surface. His reflection stared back at him. This time it didn't smile. It was just his face, tired and worn, but it was his. He took a deep breath and turned to Garen. Come with me, Arik said, his heart aching for the man who had saved him. Garen shook his head, a sad smile on his lips. I can't. My reflection is dead in the real world. There's no way for me to ever leave. I'm stuck here in this place with no way back. Aric's chest tightened. He had finally found someone who understood, who knew the pain of being trapped in this twisted world. And yet there was no way to save him. "I'm sorry," Aric whispered. Garen shook his head again, his smile fading. "Don't be. You have a chance, don't waste it. Go back to your world. Live your life." Aric nodded, his hands shaking as he turned back to the plate. He stared into his reflection, his mind racing with everything that had happened, everything Garen had told him. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward. The moment Aric crossed through the reflective surface, the air around him changed. Everything felt lighter, clearer, as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. He looked around, blinking in disbelief. He was back in the real world. For a moment he stood there, letting the realization wash over him. The people around him moved with ease, their faces kinder, their words softer. It was as if the cruelty and harshness that had surrounded him his entire life had melted away. Aric walked through the village, his heart pounding with a strange mix of relief and confusion. Everything felt right. And then something else struck him, the words. He saw a sign and instinctively read it. But this time he didn't struggle. The words were clear and easy to read, the way he had always read them, backwards. But here in this world it was normal. He wasn't strange. He wasn't mocked for it. "Everyone reads like me," Aric whispered to himself, a wave of realization crashing over him. His whole life he had been ridiculed for reading words backwards. But that was because he had been in the reflections world, where everything was flipped, distorted. Here in the real world, his way was the right way. He felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Everything that had made him feel different, mocked and broken, this was where he truly belonged. But as the relief settled in, a shadow lingered in the back of his mind. Garen was still trapped, and though the reflection was gone, the horror of what had almost happened stayed with him. He would never forget what Garen had done for him, sacrificing his own chance at freedom to save Aric. And now, Aric had a responsibility to live the life that had been stolen from him for so long. Before Aric could fully relax, Garen's final words echoed in his mind. "Your reflection is dead now, but you must make sure it stays that way." He knew what Garen had meant. The reflection had tried to take his life, to steal his eyes and return to the real world. But now that it was dead, Aric was safe. However, he would never be able to forget that a world of reflections still existed, a place where twisted versions of people lived out their worst traits. The horror of the reflections world would stay with him, even as he lived his life in peace. The darkness, the haunting dreams, the terrifying knowledge that reflections waited in the shadows, these were things he would carry with him forever. But Aric was no longer afraid. He had survived the nightmare, crossed back into his world, and now he was free. As he walked away from the village, the sun setting behind him, Aric whispered a quiet thanks to Garen, knowing that his life had been saved by a man who would never know freedom himself. And as the light faded, Aric glanced at a nearby stream. He caught a glimpse of his own face in the water, just for a second. This time it didn't smile.
In the mist-cloaked village of Varden, where the mountains rose like silent watchers, and the forests whispered ancient secrets, people whispered of beings that were rarely seen and even less understood. They were called grief collectors. No one spoke of them openly, for fear that merely mentioning their existence would summon them. But the stories were always there, passed down in hushed tones from one generation to the next. It was said that when grief became unbearable, when sorrow threatened to consume you entirely, there was a way to be free. You could seek out the grief collectors, and they would take your pain away. For those who had lost too much, the promise of relief was impossible to resist. But what the stories didn't tell was that the price for such freedom was far steeper than any could imagine. Oren had heard the legends all his life, sitting by his grandmother's hearth as she knitted by the fire. She was an old woman, her hands gnarled from years of work, her voice soft but firm. "Don't ever seek them out," she had warned him many times, her eyes dark with some unspoken sorrow. "They don't just take your grief, boy. They take a piece of you with it. And when they do, you lose more than your pain." As a child, Oren hadn't understood. The grief collectors were nothing more than old tales to frighten children into confronting their emotions. But now, as a man in his 30s, sitting alone in his cold, empty cottage, Oren understood far too well. It had been 2 years since his wife Leah had died. The sickness had come swiftly, sweeping through the village, taking lives with a cruel efficiency. Leah had been among the first to fall. Oren had watched helplessly as the light faded from her eyes, her hand growing cold in his. And then she was gone, leaving him with a hollow, gnawing pain that tore at him day after day. He had tried to carry on, to live with the grief as best he could. But it wasn't just the sadness, it was the absence. Leah had been the love of his life, and now, without her, the world felt like a barren wasteland. Every corner of their cottage reminded him of her laugh, her smile, the way she would hum softly while tending to the fire. It was unbearable. But lately, something had changed. The grief, which had once been overwhelming, had started to fade. Not in the way grief sometimes softens with time, but in a much darker, more unsettling way. At first, Oren had welcomed the relief, thinking perhaps it was a sign that he was finally healing. But soon, he realized something far worse was happening. The memories of Leah, the very things that had caused him so much pain, were slipping away. He could no longer remember the exact sound of her voice, or the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed. Even her face, once so clear in his mind, had begun to blur, and with the fading memories came something else. A hollow emptiness, a coldness that spread through him like a poison. The more he forgot, the more numb he felt. And that was when the whispers began. "They can take it all away," the voice in his mind murmured, insistent and soft. "The pain, the emptiness, they can help you." Oren tried to ignore it, tried to push the thoughts away, but the temptation grew stronger every day. He remembered his grandmother's warnings, the cryptic words she had spoken all those years ago. "When the fire no longer burns and the stars no longer shine, you'll know what to do." But what did that mean? What had she been trying to tell him? One night, after yet another stretch of sleepless hours staring into the darkness, Oren made a decision. He would find the grief collectors. If they had taken his grief, if they were the reason for this emptiness, then he needed to understand what they were. He needed to know what they had done to him. The journey took him deep into the mountains, far beyond the edges of Varden, where few dared to venture. The path was narrow and treacherous, winding through dense forests and steep cliffs. The higher he climbed, the colder it became, and soon the mist was so thick that he could barely see a few feet in front of him. But the whispers guided him, leading him deeper into the heart of the mountains. After hours of climbing, he reached a narrow, hidden trail that led into a dense, ancient forest. The trees here were unlike anything he had ever seen, tall and gnarled, their branches twisting in strange, unnatural patterns. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with some unseen energy. Then, through the trees, he saw them. At first, they were little more than shadows, dark figures moving silently through the mist. But as Oren crept closer, hiding behind a large rock, he saw them for what they truly were. The key grief collectors. There were 3 of them, dressed in flowing black robes that seemed to shimmer in the faint light. Their faces were hidden beneath deep hoods, and their movements were eerily graceful, almost as if they were gliding above the ground rather than walking. In front of them stood a massive crystal, pulsating with an eerie, sickly light. Oren watched, frozen with a mix of horror and fascination, as one of the collectors reached into its cloak and withdrew a dark, writhing mass, grief, twisted and blackened. Oren's breath caught in his throat. He had seen something like this before. His grandmother had once described it, in a rare moment of vulnerability, as the essence of loss, the very soul of sorrow, harvested from those who had given it away. The collector pressed the mass into the crystal, and the light flared brighter, casting long, twisting shadows over the forest floor. Then, something even more horrifying happened. From the ground beneath the crystal, a monstrous figure began to rise. Its body was made of smoke and shadow, its eyes burning with a malevolent hunger. It was a demon, drawn from the depths of the earth by the energy within the crystal. As the collectors fed it more grief, the demon grew larger, its form more solid, more real. The ground trembled beneath its weight, and the air itself seemed to darken with its presence. Oren's heart raced. This was what the collectors did. They didn't take grief out of mercy, they fed it to something far worse, a demon. And with each soul they drained, the demon grew stronger. As Oren watched in horror, one of the collectors turned. Its hooded face scanned the forest, its empty, hollow eyes searching. Oren ducked behind the rock, his heart pounding. He could feel its gaze sweep over him, like a cold hand brushing against his skin. He held his breath, willing himself to be still. But it was too late. The collector raised a long, bony hand pointing toward him. The other 2 collectors turned in unison, their movements unnervingly smooth, their dark forms gliding toward him. Oren's body froze with fear as the air around him grew colder, thicker, almost suffocating. Before he could move, icy hands gripped his arms, pulling him from his hiding place. They dragged him toward the crystal, their pale faces expressionless, their eyes like empty voids. Oren struggled, but their grip was unbreakable. As they brought him before the pulsating stone, the demon turned its gaze upon him, its eyes burning with an unholy hunger. "Now that you've seen," one of the collectors whispered, its voice like a blade sliding over stone, "you cannot leave." The demon reached out toward him, its massive smoky hand hovering just above Oren's head. He could feel its presence inside his mind, rooting through his thoughts, tearing at his memories. The collectors pressed their cold hands against his temples, and he felt his mind begin to unravel. The memories of Leah, their wedding day, the nights spent by the fire, the warmth of her smile, began to slip away, dissolving into the void. "You don't need them," one of the collectors whispered, its voice low and insidious. "The love, the pain, the memories, let them go. Become nothing." Oren felt his mind fragmenting, the pieces of his identity crumbling away like ash. He was losing her. He was losing everything. And then, through the fog of pain, a memory surfaced. His grandmother. Her voice clear and sharp. "When the fire no longer burns and the stars no longer shine, you'll know what to do." The fire, the stars. Oren's eyes snapped open. He remembered. In a moment of clarity, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of ash. Ashes from Leah's funeral pyre. His grandmother had given it to him, telling him to keep it close. For when the fire no longer burns. With trembling hands, Oren poured the ashes over the crystal. The reaction was immediate. The crystal let out a high-pitched, keening wail, and the light within it began to flicker. The collectors recoiled, their faces twisting in horror. The demon let out a deafening roar as its smoky form began to dissolve, unraveling as the energy it had consumed was ripped away. "You cannot!" one of the collectors hissed, reaching for him, but Oren acted quickly. He grabbed a burning torch from the ground and plunged it into the crystal. The stone shattered with a deafening crack, and a burst of light exploded outward. The force of the blast knocked Oren to the ground, and for a moment, the world was consumed by white-hot light. When the light faded, the collectors were gone. The crystal lay in ruins, and the demon had vanished, its form dissipating into the air. Oren lay on the ground, gasping for breath. His mind was reeling, but the grief, the pain, the memories, they flooded back in a rush. He could feel Leah again, her warmth, her presence, her love. It hurt, but it was real. He had found his way back. When Oren returned to Varden, he went straight to his grandmother's cottage. She was waiting for him, sitting by the fire as if she had known all along that he would come. "You've destroyed it, haven't you?" she asked softly, not looking up from the fire. Oren nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "What was it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What were they?" His grandmother sighed, her shoulders slumping as though a great weight had been lifted. "The grief collectors are not what they seem," she said quietly. "They feed on the sorrow of others, but it is not out of mercy. They gather grief for the demon they serve, feeding it the pain of those who give it away. And the more they collect, the more powerful it becomes." Oren's heart ached as he listened, the full weight of what he had seen crashing over him. "You knew," he said softly. "You gave me the ashes because you knew I would go to them." She nodded, her eyes shining with tears. "I had to, Oren. I knew you would seek them out one day. I was once like them, one of the collectors, but I escaped. I found a way to leave them, but I paid a price. For every soul I took grief from, I felt their pain tenfold. I have lived with that weight for decades, carrying the grief of hundreds. But when you destroyed the demon, you freed me from that curse." Oren's eyes widened. His grandmother, once a grief collector, now a broken woman who had borne the pain of others for years. He had freed her from the unimaginable burden she had carried. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in years, there was peace in her eyes. "You've saved us all," she whispered, "and for that, I thank you." As the fire crackled in the hearth, Oren sat beside her, his heart heavy but whole. Grief was not something to be feared or given away. It was the price of love, the proof that life had meaning. It was painful, but it was real. And now, with the demon destroyed, the people of Varden would be free to carry that burden as they should. Heavy, painful, but theirs, forever.
Cartwrights had never been ones to believe in small-town superstitions. Fresh from the noise and chaos of the bustling city, Millstone felt like a breath of fresh air. Quiet, almost too quiet. The wide streets were lined with ancient oak trees whose gnarled branches seemed to creak like old bones in the autumn wind. There was something about Millstone, though, that felt different. It was the kind of town that breathed history, where quaint customs and folklore weren't just stories. They were gospel. People here took them seriously. The Cartwrights, Ben, Sarah, and their 2 children, Ellie and James, weren't used to traditions like this. In the city, Halloween was a time for plastic decorations, costumes, and candy. No one talked about guiding lost souls or ancient rituals. But as they quickly learned, Millstone was steeped in old-world beliefs. Their introduction to these beliefs came the day Father Jonathan appeared on their doorstep, a broad smile on his face, carrying a basket of fresh bread and homemade jams. A kindly man in his late 60s, Father Jonathan had pale skin, thinning white hair, and soft brown eyes that twinkled with warmth. The townspeople seemed to adore him, and his presence immediately put the Cartwrights at ease. "Welcome to Millstone," Father Jonathan said, handing the basket to Sarah. "We don't get many new families around here, but I promise you'll love it. The town is full of life and community spirit." "Thank you," Sarah said, accepting the basket with a warm smile. "Everyone has been so friendly." "We try to look out for one another," the priest replied. "Millstone is a bit of a hidden gem, but it's a special place. Our traditions are part of what make it so." He gestured around the quiet street. The houses were old but well-maintained, and the towering oaks that lined the road gave it an almost timeless quality. It was peaceful, serene, exactly what the Cartwrights had wanted when they decided to leave the city. "There's just one thing you should know," Father Jonathan said, his tone softening as though he was about to share a secret. "Here in Millstone, we observe a special tradition on Halloween. Every house in town places a candle on their doorstep. It's an old custom, brought over by the town's founders. The candle is said to guide the spirits of the dead safely through the night." Ben chuckled, glancing at Sarah. "Sounds like an old ghost story." Father Jonathan smiled kindly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Perhaps. But traditions matter here. The candle is important, and we take it seriously. I just wanted to make sure you knew." He paused for a moment, his eyes lingering on Ben. "Make sure you don't forget." Ben nodded politely, though he didn't think much of the warning. To him, it was just another quirky custom in a small town. Sarah, on the other hand, had a lingering sense of unease. The way Father Jonathan's voice had lowered when he mentioned the candle made her feel like there was more to the story. After the priest left, they went about settling into their new home. The kids were excited, running through the empty rooms, imagining where their things would go. Ellie, the older of the 2 at 10, had already claimed the biggest room, while James, 7, was content with his smaller space as long as he got to pick out the paint color. As the weeks passed, the Cartwrights met more of their neighbors, all of whom seemed friendly and welcoming. Mrs. Mallory, their elderly next-door neighbor, brought over a bundle of candles one afternoon. Her hands were shaking slightly as she handed them to Sarah. "For Halloween," she said, her voice soft and a little nervous. "It's important you have one. You don't want to be the only house without a candle." Sarah thanked her, though the mention of the candle sent a chill down her spine. The townspeople were starting to repeat themselves. It was as if the candle was more than just a tradition. It was a rule, something they had to follow. Mr. Henderson, who ran the local hardware store, brought it up too when Ben came in to buy paint for the kids' rooms. "You're the new folks, right?" Henderson asked, ringing up the supplies. "Got kids? 2 of them," Ben said. "Then you'll want to make sure you follow the Halloween tradition. Kids talk, you know. You don't want them to feel like outsiders." Ben smiled and nodded, but the conversation left him feeling unsettled. Even the children at Ellie and James's school seemed to whisper about the candle. Ellie had overheard a group of girls in the lunchroom talking about it. "If you don't light it, the spirits get confused," one of the girls said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They think you're one of them, and they come to take you away." By the time Halloween arrived, the Cartwrights had heard the story from nearly everyone in town. But despite all the warnings, they didn't take it seriously. To them, it was just an old legend, a silly superstition. They hadn't grown up in a place where people believed in ghosts and spirits. Halloween was a night for candy and costumes, nothing more. That evening, the streets of Millstone were filled with children dressed as witches, vampires, and ghosts, running from house to house, their laughter echoing down the quiet streets. Ellie and James were no exception. Ellie was a witch, her pointy hat slipping over her eyes, and James was a vampire, constantly pulling out his plastic fangs because they hurt his gums. Ben and Sarah stood at the door, handing out candy and watching the neighborhood come to life. The houses were decorated with glowing jack-o'-lanterns, cobwebs, and skeletons. But what struck Sarah was the candles. Every house had one on their doorstep, its flame flickering in the cool autumn breeze. Every house but theirs. It wasn't intentional. They had simply forgotten. In the excitement of the night, getting the kids into their costumes, answering the door for trick-or-treaters, they hadn't thought about it. The night passed quickly, and by the time the kids were tucked into bed, the streets had fallen silent. It wasn't until Sarah was climbing into bed herself that she remembered. "The candle," she said suddenly, sitting up. "We forgot to light the candle." Ben, already half asleep, rolled over with a groan. "We'll survive one Halloween without it." But they wouldn't. That night, Ellie was the first to notice something was wrong. She woke in the middle of the night, her room icy cold, far colder than it should have been, even for late October. She pulled the blankets tighter around her, but the chill seemed to seep into her bones. Then she heard it, a faint scraping sound. At first it was so soft she thought it was the wind. But as she lay there listening, it grew louder. It was coming from her closet. Her heart raced as she sat up, staring at the closet door. She was sure it had been closed when she went to bed, but now it was slightly ajar. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. Ellie wanted to scream for her parents, but something inside her told her to stay quiet. Her breath caught in her throat as the closet door creaked open a little wider. A shadow shifted in the darkness, slipping out of the closet and onto the floor. It was low, crawling, inching closer to her bed. Ellie froze, her body rigid with fear, her voice stuck in her throat. The shadow stopped at the foot of her bed, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then it spoke, a voice like dead leaves rustling in the wind. "You forgot the candle!" Ellie screamed, the sound shattering the stillness of the night. Ben and Sarah were at her side in seconds, finding her trembling, pointing at the closet door. "Someone was in my room," she stammered, tears streaming down her face. Ben flicked on the light and checked the closet. Empty. "Ellie, it was just a bad dream." But even as he said it, the room felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with something he couldn't explain. Cold lingered in the corners, and the sense of being watched was impossible to shake. "I saw something," Ellie whispered, her voice shaking. "It said we forgot the candle." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard the stories, but they were just stories, weren't they? The townspeople couldn't really believe that a candle would keep spirits at bay. Could they? "We should light one," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling, "just in case." Ben, too tired to argue, retrieved one of the candles Mrs. Mallory had given them. He struck a match, and the moment the flame flickered to life, the air seemed to shift. The oppressive feeling lifted slightly, though the cold remained. But it was already too late. The next morning, things began to go wrong. Objects moved on their own. Chairs scraped across the floor. Picture frames fell from the walls with no explanation. Cold spots lingered in corners of the house, no matter how high the heat was turned up. And then there were the whispers. Faint at first, barely audible like a soft murmur. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. "You forgot the candle." Ben and Sarah tried to explain it away. The house was old. Maybe it was just settling. Maybe the cold was a draft they hadn't noticed before. But deep down, they knew something was wrong. The house felt alive, as though it was watching them. The children became more unsettled each night, waking up with vague memories of shadows and cold hands brushing against them. It was happening too often, too consistently to be coincidence. 3 days after Halloween, just after midnight, the doorbell rang. Ben and Sarah exchanged nervous glances. No one would be out at this hour. The doorbell rang again, longer this time, as though someone was holding their finger on the button. Ben hesitated, then went to the door. He opened it slowly, cautiously, expecting to find no one. But there was someone. Standing on the porch was Father Jonathan, holding a candle in his hand. His warm, kind smile was gone, replaced by a cold, almost cruel expression. Behind him, the Cartwrights' neighbors stood in a circle, each holding a candle of their own. Mrs. Mallory, Mr. Henderson, the other friendly faces they had met over the past few weeks, all standing in eerie silence, their candles flickering in unison. What is this?" Ben stammered, stepping back. Father Jonathan smiled, but it was a smile devoid of any warmth. "We warned you," he he said softly. The candle is not just a tradition, it's a rule. Sarah appeared behind Ben, her face pale as she took in the sight of the townspeople standing together in the dark, their faces blank, eyes cold. What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling. You did all of this? The cold, the whispers? Father Jonathan nodded, stepping forward. Millstone is not just any town. We have our ways. The candle is not to honor the dead. It is to protect the living. You ignored our tradition, and now you must be reminded. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. Reminded of what? The priest raised his candle higher, and the townspeople did the same, their movements perfectly synchronized. Of the consequences, Father Jonathan said, his voice low and threatening. This was your warning. Next time, we will take something more. Ben felt a chill run down his spine as the group began to step back into the darkness, their candles slowly vanishing into the night. Father Jonathan's final words echoed in his mind. This was just the beginning.